Hey, so I'm back after several days with a pretty bad head cold and the holidays to share part 4 of, I think, a 6-part series, How I Was Reborn on the 4th of July. I really wanted to do theology. I eventually, after living in Camden for a while, I finally started my undergrad degree in Hawaii at Hawaii Pacific University. And I did my bachelor's degree after doing a bunch of, they're called CLEP tests, but I've essentially tested out of the first year of my undergrad. So when I got to Hawaii Pacific, I did that in about 2.5 years because I really had no interest in, I had very little interest in my degree field, which was organizational management. And what I really wanted to do was theology. And when I finally applied and got in, I got to choose between Yale Divinity School up in Connecticut and Duke University, which was not far from my first duty station when I was a paratrooper at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And Yale actually offered me some money, and there was some professors there that I was excited about, but I ended up choosing Duke because it was so close to Bragg, and it had, all of those soldiers there. It had the Marines in Camp Lejeune. I just felt like it was the right choice, given that I knew I wanted to do theology and ethics around violence and international studies and stuff like that. So I chose Duke, and I began my studies in 2010, I think, is when I started my graduate education. But in between, or in the midst of finishing my undergrad, before I started my graduate studies, there's another form of education that I was really kind of lucky to have participated in. I talked about how living in Camden in the last part in community, that it was really important to me to not run away from violence in either in the abstract form of studying it, or in the literal form of going to war and having a weapon and calling for fire as an artilleryman, and living in an area where there is almost a constant threat of physical violence in Camden. And in another way, in between these two formal educational programs, as an undergrad in Hawaii and then eventually as a graduate student at Duke University Divinity School, I got the opportunity to return to Iraq as a civilian with Shane Claiborne and a bunch of Christian peacemakers that were there in Iraq for shock and awe to protest the war and the bombing. And on their way out, a bunch of them got hurt in 2003. And they were treated at this hospital in Rutba, Iraq, in Al Anbar province. And as I was finishing my undergrad, this author by the name of Greg Barrett, got in touch with me through Shane, saying, "Hey, we'd love to have you along. It'd be great to have a military perspective. We're going to go try and find the doctors that treated Shane and all the other peacemakers. Would you like to come along? I think you'd be a vital part of that experience." And so I did a lot of prayer and discerning, because there's a lot of really bad reasons to go back to your combat theater. And I was deliberately trying to take a backseat role and just kind of experience what might the Lord hold. And so that kind of set up my formal theological training, experiencing what it was like to be a former soldier who was an occupier, and get a fresh set of eyes on this thing that Christians call the good news or reconciliation, or just kind of being present for what God might hold. And so I did that in January of 2010. So the last thing I'll talk about in terms of education was something that I began in March of 2010, after having gone back to Iraq as a civilian, but before starting my graduate theology training. And that was, I participated as a testifier in the Truth Commission on Conscience and War. And I was one of a handful of soldiers who testified at this Truth Commission with Rita Nakashima Brock and Gabriella Latini and the whole team that did the Truth Commission. And so my 2-year theology program at Duke was kind of couched in between, or didn't begin until I had that experience of going back to Iraq as a civilian and then participating as a testifier at the Truth Commission on Conscience and War. And so all of this, all the, what you think of as like formal research training was not what I went to Duke for. It was very much theology as a practice that we engage in as Christians, that if we want anybody to think or act like us, we have to act like the things we say we believe. And so for my 2-year theology program, I did more than just study and research. That was just kind of boring. My first year was really difficult, in higher education. I'll talk about that in the next video. But higher education for veterans is just a weird thing to go through, being older. So after my first year, I actually convened a major conference at Duke University where we had all these speakers. We did our own fundraising. We did it on 11/11/2011, and we called it After the Yellow Ribbon Conference. And I did that on a leave of absence because the first year was really difficult, dealing with theologians and professors and also students who didn't really know much about the military. And I'm knowing a whole lot and wanting to dive into theology and dive into military service as a field of study rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so in my next video, I'll talk about my employment. After I finished my theology degree at Duke, I started teaching. I took another degree at St. Andrews University in Scotland. But that marks kind of the transition from my education to my next video, which I'll call my employment as a teacher and as a professor and a theologian, and how that things started to go wrong as I tried to embody the full scope of my experience and my training and what that seemed to call out in people in academia and Christian academia, and how that created a problem for me as someone who was coming into this space with a particular set of experiences.